Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you a closer look at the image quality on full frame of the new Tamron 70-210mm f4 DI VC USD lens. So for this comparison today, we'll mostly be looking at it on a native mount Canon 5D Mark IV, that's 30 megapixels of resolution. I also have some shots taken via adapter on the Sony a7 III that I'll share with you. Now, note that I will have a follow-up subsequent episode for those of you that shoot APS-C, and we'll want to know how it performs there. And I've got a Canon 80D that I've been shooting on it some, and so I will report back in a second episode in regards to that. Now, for these actual lens comparisons, I like to have some kind of benchmark when I do these comparisons, so I'm going to be throwing in the Tamron's own 70-200mm f2.8 G2 lens. Now, I recognize that obviously these are kind of in two different categories, classes perhaps, in terms of the image quality, certainly in terms of size and weight and cost. And that one is about $800, the other is around $1,300 or so. So there's about a $500 difference between the two. So bear that in mind when we look at the images, comparing the two side by side. But I do know at the same time, there are those that will cross shop the two lenses and say, do I really need to put up with the bigger f4, weight and cost for, what my actual shooting purposes are? Hopefully today, this episode is going to help to answer those questions. So let's jump in, let's look at some images together, and let's see how the image quality of the new Tamron 70-210, how good it actually is. Okay, let's take a look at a wide open example at 70 millimeters here from the new Tamron 70-210 millimeters. This is f4 DI VC USD. And so what you see here is both an uncorrected and then a corrected image here. And so you can see that here on full frame, that vignette is at 70 millimeters is there, but it's not particularly heavy. And after the the profile correction is applied, it is, there's a difference, but it's not a major difference. And so that's not going to be a huge concern. You can note here that there is a little bit of barrel distortion here that corrects, howbeit maybe not absolutely perfectly. You can still see a little bit of a very, very slight bulge mustache pattern that's left after the standard profile is applied. Number one, as we're going to see, and it will become even more pronounced as we move through the focal range, I want you to note the fact that on the actual G2 lens here, that it frames much wider, and we're going to see that focus breathing is, as I noted in my review of the G2, it is very, very real with the G2, whereas it's not an issue at all with the f4 lens. And so as you can see, we've got a much wider angle of view, and if we zoom in here, what you're going to see is that even all of the patterns, you can see that on the right side, the G2, that we're actually zoomed out more. And so it doesn't frame up identically. Now, looking at the center of the frame, while both lenses look good, we can see that the G2, even at f2.8, looks sharper in the center of the frame, has a little bit higher contrast. And if we move out towards the edge of the frame, a couple of things to observe there. First of all, G2 continues to be very, very strong and stronger at the edge. But also at the f4 lens, we see that the sharpness profile is pretty consistent across the frame. It's not a lot softer on the edges than what it is in the center. Also, we can see here there's some good centering on both of these lenses, and so they're equally sharp on both sides. Now, if we stop down the G2 lens down to f4, we can see that, of course, now because it has the advantage of being stopped down, that the corners are brighter. Not the vignette is terrible here, but we can see it is a little bit brighter here. What we can also see, that you'll see throughout this series, is that even though the actual color balance is basically the same, the f4 lens trends just a little bit cooler than what the G2 does. The G2 is very good at giving us quite a balanced color rendition, and so it's just very, very so slightly on the cool side with the f4 lens. Now, of course, with the G2 stop down, it was already had a sharpness advantage to begin with. So with it stop down to f4, we can see that it does have a somewhat significant sharpness advantage. It's a very sharp lens, and that doesn't necessarily take away from the f4 lens, but just note that the G2, more expensive G2 lens, yeah, it's bigger, it's more expensive, all those things, but it is also sharper. And so that's an advantage it has in sharpness in contrast. Okay, now if we stop both lenses down to f5.6 and take a look, you can see that the gap maybe is closed a little bit, but you can definitely tell that the G2 is still sharper. If we move off towards the edge of the frame, that becomes a little bit more obvious. And so at 70 millimeters, the G2 lens is sharper and has a little bit better contrast, but at the same time, the f4 lens is still delivering a very good result. Now, if we compare at 100 millimeters, first of all, you can note again that very, very slight cooler rendition here and the little more neutral result of the G2. A couple of other things to note is that even though the G2 is, I missed 100 millimeters by 3 millimeters, you can see that even so, it is framing definitely wider than what the f4 lens is. And so, just take a look at this section versus this section, see how much more of this is exposed. Meanwhile, over on this side, there's just a minuscule difference on the right side. And so definitely a difference in framing due to that focus breathing. Now, in terms of sharpness, again, this is f4 versus f2.8. But once again, like at 70 millimeters, it's not a huge difference, but we can see that there is a bit of an advantage in the center of the frame for the G2 lens. However, both lenses are very sharp. Moving off to the side of the frame, once again, both lenses do a good job of maintaining the sharpness profile out to the edge, just that the higher sharpness of the G2 lens shows up there where it is a little bit sharper. Now, it's worth noting on both of these that, although we have maybe just at the very, very extreme edge of the corner, a little bit of fall off on the f4, you can see with the G2, it's sharp from corner to corner. Both lenses are pretty impressive there. Now with the G2 stop down to f4, obviously we see just even more sharpness and contrast, a really impressive amount from that. And of course, now we see a little bit more advantage on the edges for the G2 at when it's stopped down. Now with both of them at f5.6, the advantage is pretty slight here. I do still very slightly favor I think a little bit higher contrast on the G2 lens, but as you can see, they're really quite close. And looking out at the edge of the frame, we can see now that the f4 lens is also sharp right out to the edge. If not at the absolute levels of the G2, it is very, very high. This is a great performance here. Now with both lenses at 135 millimeters, you can see that at this point, at f2.8, the vignette is actually a little bit heavier on the G2 lens, wide open there. You can also see once again that, due to that focus breathing, that we see just more image on the G2 lens than we do on the f4 lens. And so, again, that's the nature of the beast there with the focus breathing. And you can also see, just if you look at the size of these sections, you can see that they look smaller on the right side. It's exact same camera, Canon 5D Mark IV, exact same resolution. So this is due to a little bit wider framing. What you can also see is the pattern remains in that while they are close, the G2 lens is just a little bit sharper, a little bit higher contrast towards the center of the frame. Out on the edge of the frame, the same is true, that both lenses look good. The G2 just looks a little bit better. And so, a very sharp performance from both lenses. Now, if we stop down to f4 here, just jumping out and looking globally, we can see some of that vignette has cleared up. So they're now fairly similar when it comes to the vignette. The edge of the frame, of course, now the G2 is sharper yet out at the edge. And so, it does look better, but this still looks very credible, even wide open at 135 millimeters. With both lenses stopped down to f5.6, I give an advantage to the f4 lens when it comes to the vignette, which vignette is still, you can tell, just a little bit heavier on the actual G2 lens, even though it stopped down 2 stops as opposed to 1 stop for the f4. And so both of them at f5.6, we see, I would say, pretty close to equal results in the center of the frame. Both of them look extremely sharp at this point. out along the edge of the frame. Maybe the most minor advantage for the G2, but I would say that 135mm stop down is the closest performance that we've seen from the two lenses, a very equal type performance, and it is uniformly excellent. Now at 210mm, the greatest kind of optical defect here from this lens is the fact that it vignettes quite heavily across a pretty good portion of the frame. Case in point is this is just the standard profile applied from this is Adobe Camera Raw or Lightroom profile that's being applied. And so you can see how much brighter it looks, not just like in the edges of the frame, but here's a vignette that basically is covering a good portion of the frame. And in fact, this is the exact same image. If we zoom in and we look at the center of the frame here, we can see that this looks brighter on the side, even just zoomed into the very, very center of the frame. And so I would say that there is some vignette lift being applied across the whole frame. And so, just something worth noting. There is some pretty heavy vignette there, and if we compare corners, you can see it's a significant difference after correction. Now, when comparing it to the G2, a few things stand out to me. The G2 at wide open, it obviously does vignette similarly in the sense that it has vignette, but it doesn't vignette, it kind of vignettes in a more traditional pattern where you can actually see the kind of the circular type effect. Meanwhile, the center of the frame is actually quite bright, and I found that it had excellent light transmission. You can see zoomed in that it's a significant difference. What you can also see is that the color balance issue is the most pronounced here at 200mm, whereas the the f4 lens has trended, I would say, cooler yet, and this has retained a little bit more neutral type profile. Also, take a look here and you can see that, while they don't line up perfectly, and that's due to the fact that, no tripod collar, and to put it fair in terms of length, I didn't use the tripod collar on the G2 lens, and so that it wouldn't move any closer to the target. But you can tell that, despite trying to fix the tripod not to move, there's a little bit more sag, particularly with this one that is a heavier lens. But what you can also see when you zoom in, and let me just maybe get to near one of these lines, you can see how much wider the grout lines look compared to this, and that is because there is so much more focused breathing taking place on the G2, and of course there is an extra 10mm of focal length anyway. So this lens definitely gives you more reach in any situation, but most noticeably in close to medium distances because of the focus breathing. Now, looking at them both wide open, the G2 lens is definitely sharper in the center of the frame. Good news is here at the center of the frame, we are still getting a sharp performance. There's a little bit of veiling there that will reduce absolute sharpness just a hair. And I would say that our corner edge performance is the softest that what we've seen from this lens wide open. The G2 is actually still doing quite well, even at f2.8. And I would have said in times past that 200mm is the weakest point on the G2 lens, but it's looking pretty good in this comparison. Now, if I stop the G2 down to f4, you can see that there's a pretty pronounced sharpness and contrast difference between the two lenses. And so at the long end of the focal range, the G2 holds up better. We'll stop them both down to f5.6. At f5.6, there is a mild improvement for the Tamron. It's still sharper with the G2 lens by a noticeable amount. Edges are a little bit improved here, but definitely not to the level of the G2 lens. Now, if we stop it on down to f8, we see that there is, again, some mild improvement. Definitely contrast is better. There is a little bit more resolution, and so an improvement there. Looking out at the edge, it's kind of the same thing. There is a mild improvement towards the edge. It's maybe still not fantastic, but now it's looking pretty good. And so just note that, if you're wanting to maximize, say, for shooting landscapes, stopping down is going to make a difference. Now, in real-world shooting, even at the weakest point, 210mm, if you take that out and put that in the real world, this is again on the 5D Mark IV, you can see that you've really got quite a nice amount of resolution there. Nothing to be ashamed of. Nice result there. And so let's stick with a few more real-world examples. Here we can see both, great color and contrast. And again, this is at 210 millimeters on our sign here, which is our plane of focus. Everything looks nice and crisp, and you can see a fairly nicely defocused background. And again, I think the colors look nice with this image. This is actually using the Sony a7 III and the MC11, and so this is a 24 megapixel, and we can see sharpness here looks quite nice. And then looking at what is a very, very busy scene, a lot of bare branches, there's definitely some hard edges that I see here. At the same time, even in the midst of all of this tangle, the bokeh quality isn't bad. It's just not the best that I've ever seen for handling these kind of, maybe transition zone type objects here. Here's another image taken just a few minutes later, and so we can see that resolution-wise, our subject is nice and crisp, lots of details there in the fur, nice focus there, and once again with our bokeh quality, it looks pretty good here overall. There's less of stuff in the transition zone. There's something here that's, you can see some hard edges, but overall that looks pretty good. Now here's an image where the bokeh quality is allowed to shine a little bit more, less kind of objects that are going to grab the eye. And so here you can certainly see you're capable of getting some nice creamy out of focus bokeh results and a nice sharpness on the plane of focus on the subject there. Color also looks good here. Now, a lot of people are interested in an f4 lens in this focal length for shooting landscapes, because the compression that a telephoto provides obviously gives you a unique image, a different approach here. And so here, this is the spring thaw, ice breaking up over a lake. And so let's just look at our sharpness here. Color looks good. And we can see that we have nice sharpness right out to the edge of the frame here in these trees here, and a beautiful color rendition. Looks very nice. Looking at the other side of the frame, we see that the same is true. Nice detail across there. So certainly when stopped down, this is going to provide a very nice landscape option for those interested in something like that. Now, looking at its flare resistance, and also at the same time we can look at things like chromatic aberrations and how they are controlled. Here we can see there's definitely some veiling. You can tell that the sun is just right off the edge of the frame, and so that is allowing you to see that there is some veiling if the sun is right out of the frame. A couple of things I want to point out here. Number one, we can see this is not necessarily onion pattern, but there is some busyness in that bokeh circle there. Not unusual with a zoom lens, but anyway, looking also here, we see that in these kind of transition areas that we're not seeing a lot of chromatic aberrations. I have seen a bit of them in the most extreme situations, but not to any kind of major degree that's going to affect images. Now here in this second image, we see that if we move that sun just a little bit more out of the frame and kind of recompose here, we have a lot less veiling. Although I will say that the veiling that I've seen is fairly artistic. Looking at, again, we've got sharpness on our subject, but as I look at different spots where we might see some, kind of green or purple fringing, I think that that is reasonably well controlled here. Finally, if we actually move over and compose with the sun right into the frame, we can see some very pronounced veiling and loss of contrast. A little bit of a ghosting artifact here. That's not really overly destructive. So this is either a good or a bad scenario, depending on, whether you consider this to be artistic or you consider this to be destructive to your image quality. And so there certainly is some veiling that will take place with the sun in the frame. At the same time, the resulting image, I personally think, is visually pleasing. It won't necessarily be in every situation, so you have to use the lens wisely. So as you can see, for the most part, I would say that the picture is pretty positive here. While the 70-210 doesn't quite attain to the very high image quality levels of the Tamron 70-200 f2.8 G2 lens, remember also that I compared that lens to kind of the gold standard, which has been Canon's own 70-200mm f2.8 2.8L Mark II. And at a number of focal lengths, the Tamron was actually the sharper lens. And so it's a very, very, very good lens. And so as a benchmark, it shows you that while the 70-210 f4 lens is not quite at that level, it is delivering a really strong image quality performance. Probably our weakest performance came at 210 millimeters, not unexpected, and but still you have a good performance, and I have found with real-world images that they still look very good, and so there's a lot of resolution there. So really the only other kind of optical defect maybe that I would point to is that we did see that it does vignette pretty heavily at the long end of the focal length. Not bad anywhere else really. And we also noted that, you know, it is a little bit flare prone if put in the right or wrong situation, however you want to determine that. But you do need to be careful with how you place the sun if you don't want some of that veiling. Of course, if you want some of that artistic look to your shot, then by all means put the sun in the frame. All told, there's nothing here that I found particularly discouraging, and hopefully it maybe answered some questions for you. Stay tuned for that APS-C episode, and then in my final review, I'll also talk a little bit more about you know, kind of the sum total of using the lens, including things like autofocus and how I think it actually performs in an absolute sense. In the meantime, you can always check out the image gallery that's linked to in the description down below. There are some buying links if you'd like to order one for yourself. And of course, you can follow me on social media, sign up for my newsletter, and if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.